Chris, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thanks, Jake. Thanks for having me, mate. I'm doing really well. How are you?
I am brilliant. I specifically didn't have Bitcoin in the title of this podcast because I think that we can look at Bitcoin in lots of different ways and it comes up in lots of areas, which is fun. But predominantly, this is an investment podcast. Something that just caught my attention so much is that you were someone that clearly came across Bitcoin quite a long time ago now. And it really resonated with you so strongly that you went basically all in. Famously, you don't even check the Bitcoin price. Now, I don't know if that particular quirk has changed, but take us back, Chris. Why did you get so into Bitcoin?
Well, look, maybe it wasn't fast enough. Otherwise, things would be very different for me. But nonetheless, I'm still very pleased with the decisions I have made over the last 15 years or so. But if we take it back far enough, like many people that were around in 2010, call it, the only thing that really Bitcoin was doing back then was facilitating trade on darknet markets. So that's the first exposure that I had to Bitcoin. I grew up a bit of a punk, a bit of a cypherpunk, and just kind of, I was in a heavy metal rock band as a screamo vocalist. So I was always a bit rebellious and punky. I had much longer hair, no beard, but very long hair. And I'd be smashing my head up and down every week.
Really?
Some gig.
Oh, you never told me that before. Cool.
Yeah, probably a lot of Bitcoiners actually wouldn't know that about me. But yeah, I was in a heavy metal band coming out of high school. We released a couple of CDs. If anyone's interested, they can have a look at us on Spotify and stuff. The band was called I Escape. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome.
Yeah, I, Escape.
Okay.
But yeah, it was a lot of fun. But I was very rebellious and super into like alternative ways of thinking and conspiracy theories and just your standard sort of punk activities, I guess. So I came across Bitcoin not from a financial or an economical lens, but just from a, I guess, cypherpunk alternative medium lens. And, I had no formal training whatsoever in economics or anything like that. It's just things that I've absorbed and learned over the years. So I didn't initially fall super deep into Bitcoin. It definitely piqued my interest and, I thought it was very fascinating, but it wasn't actually until about 2015, maybe 2014, 2015. So a few years later where I actually picked up the Bitcoin white paper and read that. And that was kind of when it really started to click for me. Obviously, there's a lot more substance there in the Bitcoin white paper, and I urge everyone to read it if they haven't, even if you don't understand the pages on the heavy mathematics, even just the abstract alone, if you can get through that, 10, 15 lines, that's going to be worth your time. So it was kind of like 2015 where I really went, okay, this is really interesting. It's still around. It's got a lot more depth to it than just people buying and selling weird shit online on some weird marketplace accessed by some other weird software called Tor. All of those things like roped me in initially, but it was reading the white paper that kind of really kicked off my Bitcoin journey.
Wow. We'll definitely dissect that in a sec, but I don't want to gloss over this idea of being a punk. So first of all, you use the phrase cypherpunk. There'll be some people out there that don't know what that means. So let's dig that apart for a moment. So what is a cypherpunk?
Oh, look, I probably wouldn't call myself one per se, but the cypherpunk movement has been around for quite some time, and very much the early days of Bitcoin, I think, originated from that sort of subset of individuals who are very much against the norms, which I guess is where I come into it. But I'm certainly not a developer or a super technical minded person that was trying to build code or anything like of that nature. We'll get that nice and quickly out of the way. But definitely, was interested into alternative thinking and, questioning everything. I just grew up questioning absolutely everything.
Really?
Would love, just everything. Like it was, I just found it so fascinating to like think about things. I know as silly as that sounds, I'm a big thinker. I like to think that's probably like one of the things that makes me very unique is I like dissect everything. And, I came across Bitcoin or anything in my life, and I tend to go quite hard and I also go quite deep. And so, I think it really spoke to me because it is very edgy. It is very punky. It is very alternative. And once you kind of get roped in by that and go deeper, then you start to understand the substance and the meaning and the properties and the principles that Bitcoin stands on. And that's what really keeps me here.
To dovetail off that, Chris, there's an essay, I've just dug it up from my notes. It's the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. Timothy May wrote this back in 1988, which is mad. It's a long time ago, but the point is this cypherpunk movement is much older than Bitcoin. Bitcoin is something that came out of it as a result. But these guys for a long time have been talking about, well, what does it mean if we have a digital world? And what does it mean if that digital world is not decentralized? Like, what happens to privacy? What happens to anonymity? How do we control, or not necessarily how can we control, but how do we allow a digital world that upholds freedom of speech, upholds freedom of movement, upholds freedom of trade, freedom of thought? It's so fascinating. I agree. And so when you talk about the attributes here that keep you interested, like, what would you say those things are?
I think a lot of the things you just touched on, freedom, privacy, people's personal responsibility, their liberties, all of those things are super important. I think growing up, I sort of learnt to appreciate those things. We're not born with the idea of understanding privacy and having appreciation for all of those things. But over time, growing up, and again through my years of being a punk and being in the band and writing music and basically being disgruntled with life, so to speak, a classic punk story, I explored all of these ideas both internally and externally. And then, Bitcoin came along and kind of said, okay, well, here's a tool that you can use to kind of improve those aspects of your life, improve your privacy, improve your freedom to spend, improve your anonymity, all of those things that you mentioned. Bitcoin helps kind of engage those properties and make your life better for a better lack of term.
And so forgive me if I'm being a bit naive here, but when you think of something that's punky or something that represents punk, why would accountability be part of that? Is that something that Bitcoin taught you, or is that something that I just don't really understand from punk culture?
That's a great question. Maybe I've never actually thought about it too deeply, whether those two worlds collide or not. I don't often talk about these things, to be fair. My older life is kind of more or less separated from my current Bitcoiner life, which is the last decade. But I do think there are natural crossovers and predispositions between those two persons of me, if you want to say. But accountability is really interesting because I think from like a punk lens, it's very fuck you to the system and all of that sort of stuff, and very, anti things. Whereas accountability is, taking responsibility and having ownership of certain things. You could argue that those are at odds with each other. I'm not really sure, to be honest, but certainly accountability in Bitcoin has reshaped my thinking around that, because Bitcoin is a fair system. It is a open, decentralized protocol, and with that becomes accountability. Everyone can see that. There's no hidden curtains. There's no things happening behind closed doors. It's all there for everyone to see. And I think that is, at least from a monetary perspective, a much better way to lay down the foundations for a fairer system for all.
Yeah, that's something very powerful, isn't it? The idea of a meritocracy. How do you think of Bitcoin as a meritocracy, and why is it the case? So if someone doesn't really know much about Bitcoin, how would you talk them through that?
Great question. Well, I think because, if we look at it from the fiat perspective, from how traditional finance has worked for as long as I've been born and much longer, it's very much rule makers and people adhering to those rules. And if you don't, then you're punished in some shape or form. Whereas Bitcoin is very much, here are the rules. Everyone can play by those rules. They're publicly known. They're not going to be changed at a whim or at a 11-hour boardroom meeting in some dark room. It's all there. It's all fair. It's all open for everyone to participate. And in theory, anyone can change those rules through the mechanisms in place on the Bitcoin protocol, through BIPs and other mechanisms. So I think that is a much better way to build at least a financial system for all 8 billion plus people on Earth. Whereas what we currently have is very much an unfair system designed to please a few and punish the majority, which, you can see. Everyone can look around anywhere in the world, even first world, third world, anywhere in between. There are problems, and those problems generally do stem from a broken monetary system.
Yeah, it's that lovely phrase that Bitcoin enables a scenario where you're ruled by rules and not by rulers, which helps to kind of simplify it in a sense, doesn't it? Like, oh, okay. And it's also so important because one of the common bits of FUD is like, oh, the insiders, they bought ages ago and now you're just pumping their bags and there's not really any way of changing that. So Bitcoin's unfair. I wouldn't buy Bitcoin. I'd buy this altcoin over here, which I happen to be the insider for, but you might as well get in early because it's, the unit price or the unit bias isn't as bad. You can get one of these for $1 instead of 100,000.
Yeah, the unit bias is very real, certainly. And to your point earlier, we can discuss this if you'd like to touch on the idea of me not checking the price to answer your question.
So why? Yeah, I love talking about this kind of thing because you meet all sorts of characters through this amazing experience that is Bitcoin, and people just bring different concepts to the table that naturally evolve. Go for it, Chris. I mean, have you checked the price anytime recently?
No, so I'm happy to give the backstory.
Yeah, do. I love it.
So it all originated, I think it was the end of 2021, if I remember correctly. My years might be wrong because things are just moving so quickly, but it's been 3 years. But basically I'd put a tweet out, and I'm not heavily followed. I have probably back then I had maybe even like 1,000 or 1,500 followers. Now I have like 3,000, by no means popular or famous, and I'm happy to keep it that way. But I put a tweet out and basically said, and I'm not a gambling man either, but I did say, hey, would anyone like to take a bet, not an actual put money on the table bet, but just a friendly bet in terms of how long we could go not checking the price of Bitcoin in dollar terms. And I basically said, I'm aiming for 12 months. Anyone in? And again, to prove my point about not being famous, not a single person replied to that.
That tumbleweed meme.
Yeah, kind of... basically. Yeah, basically. Not that I was expecting it, but I thought, I'll put it out there. I've kind of used Twitter more or less as like a personal diary. I don't really care who's there and who's engaged and who's watching. It's just there for my own thoughts. I mentioned earlier, I'm a big thinker, so I like to put those thoughts onto paper, so to speak. But anyways, fast forward, I started doing it, and I started sort of doing monthly like blogs, I guess you could say, kind of tracking my experiences. Day 4, unfortunately, I saw a chart, but now I've learned that I should be like muting certain keywords on my social channels to avoid that. So it was a bit of a learning experience.
Yep.
It wasn't perfect to begin with, of course, when you're fully in the Bitcoin ecosystem. It's hard to avoid the price, but over time I learned certain mechanisms, muting words and scrolling past charts really quickly and just not engaging. And also what ended up happening was a lot of people didn't take me seriously to begin with, which is fair enough. I don't even know if I took myself seriously, but I really wanted to give it a go as an experiment to see if I could actually do it. And after a few months of people kind of jokingly saying, "Oh, hey, Chris, the price of Bitcoin is 25,000." Ha ha ha.
Gotcha.
And then I'd remind them like, "Hey, that's funny, but I'm actually serious. I do want to try avoid it. And look, I can't tell you what to say or what to do, but if we're going to converse out of respect, it would be great if you could try that. Like, try not to." Talk to your other friends about it, but when we discuss between ourselves, that's not a topic I want to cover. Eventually people kind of started catching on and actually being quite respectful about it and saying like, I jump on calls now and people would be talking about price and then they'd see me join and then they say, oh, we'll pick this conversation up later, which is actually quite nice and accommodating. So we've come a long way, but basically I reached the year. I got to the end of the year. I think it was 2023 or 2022. And I basically said, okay, cool. I made it more or less. I had a few hiccups along the way just from the learning of it all. But more or less, I didn't actively go out there and check it. And, I come from a place where I've been in Bitcoin for 10 plus years. I was madly refreshing CoinMarketCap and my portfolio trackers and all that sort of stuff, like most people do when they're first starting out, right? What happened in that last 10 minutes as if it matters. And that was one of the things I wanted to try to solve because it doesn't matter. Bitcoin helps lower your time preference. Before I got into Bitcoin, I didn't even know what time preference meant. So like we've come a long way, so to speak. But I got to 12 months and then I thought, this is actually quite nice. It does remove a lot of the noise and a lot of the stress and the anxiety and the volatility, I guess, of having to check the price and stress about because when you're heavily exposed like I am, a volatile swing can change your net wealth overnight significantly. But to me, it didn't matter because we're measuring in the wrong instrument and we're looking at it in the wrong time preference. So I got to 12 months and I thought, okay, let's keep going. I'm going to do 2 years. And then I did 2 years and kind of was getting really polished in the way that I just didn't even think about it. I think they say it takes about 21 days to create a habit. I mean, maybe a habit of this regard takes a little longer, but I was fully into the idea of not checking the price, and I'm still going. It's like over 3 years now. So into the 4th year now. I did find out the price once we hit that big milestone. That was one of the things that was completely unavoidable. Hitting 100K, I think it was late last year sometime, maybe November, December, I can't remember exactly, but it was just like as if fireworks erupted globally. It was like you couldn't not know that it hit 100K, regardless of how you'd have to lock yourself in a cave or something.
Well, and especially when all your mates are into Bitcoin too as well.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So it was really unavoidable. But in terms of where we're at now, I can assume we're around that mark, but I don't know. Like we could be below it, we could be up, but the point is it doesn't matter. Actually read this. Measuring Bitcoin in dollars is like measuring the future using a tool from the past, which I thought was quite nice. I used to say measuring Bitcoin in dollar terms was like going outside and trying to measure the air temperature, but using a tape measure. It's just like they're totally incompatible. You're using the wrong tool to measure the wrong metric. And that's kind of how I view looking at fiat dollar value of Bitcoin. It just doesn't make sense. It's not a useful metric. Lots of people argue, but it brings so many people to Bitcoin and number go up is the best marketing tool. And I'm not refuting any of those things. And people are more than welcome to talk about the price and do whatever the hell they want. But for me, my personal stance is the most important thing for me is how do I keep Bitcoin secure and within my family for the next 100 years? Everything else it doesn't matter. Bitcoin could go to zero. It could go, well, if it goes to zero, then I guess it doesn't matter because I'm holding something worthless. But at this point, I think we can all agree that it's not going to zero. But if it goes to 50,000...
Very, 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 very unlikely.
It's very unlikely. It's very unlikely.
We're more likely to drop dead as individuals than Bitcoin go to zero, from some freak accident.
Exactly. And that's more important to me because if I drop dead tomorrow, what happens to my Bitcoin? Right? I need to have the mechanisms in place to make sure that it goes to where I want it to go. My family, my kids, all that sort of stuff. So that's more important to me. So by checking the price of Bitcoin is simply distracting me from my main goal, which is keeping it secure for 100 years. And we're talking beyond my own lifetime. I'm certainly not going to live to 135, right? Not without some technological advancement that we don't yet know about. So all of these things to say that it just creates a lot of stress, a lot of noise, a lot of anxiety, a lot of volatility that just isn't required for, I guess, my personal level of conviction with Bitcoin. It's going to every number you could possibly imagine. It's going to go, it's already been from 0 to 100,000. It's going to go from 100,000 to 200 to 300 to 400 to 500 to 1 million to 5 million. Like at this point, I don't really have all that much doubt. Of course, I could be wrong, but I'm living under the conviction lens that it is going to do all those things. And if it does, then how am I going to keep that safe throughout that period?
Oh my gosh, Chris, so many cool things to touch on there. When you don't check the Bitcoin price, like how do you do your accounting in day-to-day life? So are you running totally on a Bitcoin standard where you're getting paid in Bitcoin and you only spend using Bitcoin? Or do you still have a fiat bank account that you're using for like everyday life? What would be some of the biggest challenges you've had to overcome in order to do that smoothly and not get caught out every day?
That was also part of the experiment as well. As it stands currently, I do have a fiat income. So it's changed a little bit since prior years. So now it's like I do have a bank account and I have fiat inflow. And that's the first thing to go outflow because it's devaluing constantly. So the incentive model is get rid of your fiat, hold on to your Bitcoin. But previously, earning Bitcoin, saving in Bitcoin, and spending in Bitcoin, being totally in the circular economy, then there is no requirement to more or less have a bank account or to think about fiat. The way that I look at it was, how many sats am I spending to acquire the thing that I need? Am I spending more sats or am I spending less sats over time?
Interesting. So the
thing that I need is more or less
it's a
stable.
sat to thing exchange rate rather than
Correct.
a thing to dollars to sats. Yeah. Okay,
obviously, there's inflation in those things. So, the cost of bread and the cost of groceries and petrol and all that stuff's going up over time, but it's not happening insanely in front of our eyes. It's happening slowly over time. I'd see trends. I would say, okay, well, 2 years ago or 6 months ago, this $100 purchase used to cost me 55,000 sats, whatever the number is. Now it costs me 48. That's interesting. But that would suggest to me that the price of Bitcoin is going up in dollar terms. But what's more interesting is I'm noticing my purchasing power going further along. That's exactly what I want to be happening. The opposite happens in fiat. That dollar or that $100 that used to buy you that bag of groceries now costs 200, and you've got the same amount of groceries. The quality of the groceries haven't changed. It's the exact same products, but on a fiat standard, you're seeing the reverse occur compared to the Bitcoin standard. So that was the way that I sort of measured it, if you want to think about it, was just noticing my purchasing power increase over time.
Yeah, makes sense. It's not the same by any means, but a small example where I've actually felt that, because I think it's so important to actually touch and use this stuff and see how it feels. And I generated about 10,000 Aussie dollars worth of sponsorship income when I created Bitcoin with Jake over 12 months, 80 episodes or whatever. And I got paid in Bitcoin, and I paid the costs of having a producer and any subscriptions, etc., in dollars. And I kept the Bitcoin in a wallet. And as of today, I think there's about 13,000 Aussie dollars worth of purchasing power still in there, and I've used it for loads and loads and loads of random shit. It became like a small account that I would draw down from for, sending lightning payments to people for things or whatever the case might be. But let's just say I've definitely not added $2,000 to it. I've spent probably 4 times that, but still the SAT's purchasing power has gone up. It's this battery that instead of dying, it's constantly refueling. It's magical, really, isn't it? Like how it actually functions. What I'd like to ask about, Chris, is then by being able to kind of cancel out the noise, the anxiety, the potential kind of short-term volatility, freak out, it opens up space for other things to fall into your attention. What's come out of that these last couple of years that you're really excited about?
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think that's actually one of the most important aspects of this whole experiment for me, was that it gave me the confidence and the time to explore other things that were very important to my life. Now that I have my financial security sorted, I know that I'm not being debased. I know that my labor from the efforts that I produce in the marketplace is being respected and protected over time. I can now go and do things that are important other than those things. So focusing on my health, I had a few health issues that I had to deal with. Nothing super serious, but ones that were plaguing me for a very long time. Even when I was back in the high school days, things that I just neglected, classic early adult life. You want to go out, you want to have fun, you want to explore the world. And then
you're a punk rocker, mate.
I'm a punk rocker, yeah. I don't feel pain or I feel the most pain. I don't know. But yeah, now that I've got that element sort of packed away and sorted, I can now focus on those things. So I took the time to look after my body and got those old ailments sorted. I managed to work on my relationships and both my family, but both my partner, and finding the right partner to start a family and a life with. Other things that are really, really critical to the purpose and the meaning of my life can now be unlocked, because I'm not sitting there going, got to work today, I'm super stressed, I've got to pay the mortgage, I've got to make sure I can do this, the groceries are getting more expensive and we're going backwards and I'm living paycheck to paycheck. Like, I've been there, don't get me wrong, and I know a lot of people who are probably listening to this are in that same position. And the Bitcoin has unlocked that time and that freedom for me. I'm not by any means like insanely wealthy. People might be listening to, oh, Easy got in 2010. He's probably got 3,000 Bitcoin or something. Like, I wish, it was definitely an opportunity missed and an opportunity lost, but that's not what drives me. What drives me are those other things that I talk about, finding purpose, finding meaning, trying to make the world a better place, trying to do things that bring me joy. So yeah, I think that's one of the most underrated aspects of coming onto a Bitcoin standard is all of the indirect and other tangential benefits that you get from adopting a Bitcoin standard.
Awesome. And so something that this podcast is about, I didn't have Bitcoin in the title. It's about investing. Just to recap, and apologies for anyone listening that's heard me talk about this. There's basically three main tranches of capital: financial, humanistic, and intellectual. The humanistic and intellectual capital largely drive the financial returns. When you invest in relationships, in family, when you invest in yourself, your skill set, your network, that's what drives financial returns. But what is so fascinating to me is this huge merry-go-round and distraction that is the current world of finance, that's sold as this problem-solving service to keep your wealth. It's a game of you've got to outpace inflation. And it's such a murky game that we don't even know what the real rate of inflation is. They just stopped creating the reports. You cannot find out. It's crazy. In 2006, I think they stopped doing it or something. I tried to find it recently. If you try and find the base money supply of British pounds, you can't. It's absolutely wild. And so Bitcoin's this thing where it's as you've described, you can adopt it in a meaningful fashion. Yes, of course, everyone wishes they were earlier. And yes, everyone wishes they bought more. But then your life starts to change. What have been some of the biggest changes? And what are you doing today that you never expected to be involved in?
Pretty much everything I'm doing, to be
really
honest.
Awesome.
Well, I left high school and I had no idea. I mean, this is not unique in any regard, but I had literally no idea what I was doing. I finished school. I was like, what now? I had no interest in going to university. I had no job lined up. I had nothing. I wasn't the dumbest kid, but I wasn't one of the top kids either. School didn't work for me, if I'm being completely honest. It's not the way that they deliver the learning and the education just doesn't click with me. But again, not unique by any means at all. Education system is very much a one size fits all, and it doesn't really fit all.
Yeah, but there's very few people I think that it actually fits. Ironically,
yeah. Exactly. But I kind of got forced into a mechanical engineering apprenticeship by my brother. He's like, "Here you go, I got you this job." He literally applied for me and got me the job in a mechanical engineering shop. And I was like, what is that? I didn't know what that no, I'm not even kidding with you, Jake. I did not know what that trade was. I got an apprenticeship in a fitter machinist operator, and I had no idea what it was. You could have said, "Hey, you're going to be an electrician." I kind of have an idea of what that is. They work with electronics and they do all that sort of stuff, wiring, and I get that power. But plumbing, you can get an idea of what a plumber does. I had no idea what a fitter machinist did. And I walked into that job the first day and I looked at the machine. They're like, "That's a lathe." I'm like, "What's a lathe?" It's one of the bread and butter machinery that you would deal with. And I had no idea what it was. So I kind of just fell into it. So what I'm doing now is a far cry from where I was 15 years ago working in manufacturing plants. I did quite well. I progressed through the natural evolution of working as an apprentice and then going to another shop, becoming a team lead, and then going to a bigger establishment. I was working for a very, very large aluminium manufacturer, I think the third largest in the world at the time. I was doing really, really well financially from a 19-year-old perspective, but that's not a career that I was passionate about, that provided me no meaning or purpose in life. It was just a job. And again, that's probably what the majority of people find themselves in. It sort of wasn't until I took the big plunge and the big risk with nothing. I started with absolutely nothing, moved to Melbourne and started my first company, which was Coinstop, reselling hardware wallets to people around the country. And the kind of, as they say, the rest is history. I was living off a credit card with a broken leg for 3 months while I was trying to start this business, living on debt because I believed and I really wanted to make this happen. I really wanted to work for myself. I understood the value proposition of Bitcoin, and the early signs of the business were hey, we actually found something that's quite good here. selling hardware wallets before anyone else had done that in this
That
country.
was roughly 2015, Chris?
Yeah. 2016 was when we started the business.
Okay.
And that ran until 2024. So almost 9 years, 9 years that we ran that business. And that was a hell of a lot of great experience, many mistakes. But that's the kind of way I like to learn, is I want to get thrown in the deep end, figure out how to swim, and then thrive and survive based on that experience. But it's really, really different to what I was doing before. And I know many Bitcoiners who work in this industry now come from very different backgrounds, because they found Bitcoin and it's opened up a new part of their brain that wants to spend basically every living minute thinking and doing something with Bitcoin. That's how important I think this technology is. That I say this, I've said this many times before, I think it's the most important piece of technology of the last 100 years and perhaps the next 100 as well. And I don't say that lightly, because we've had many great technological advancements, including the internet. I think the internet has reshaped modern society like few other things have. And I think Bitcoin's actually going to give the internet a run for its money in terms of impact, which is kind of hard to fathom right now because it's early days and it's still this niche, obscure, fake internet money thing. But once people unpack it and once it starts getting more globally adopted, I think you're going to see those second and third order effects of Bitcoin, like it has happened on a personal level for me, happen on a global level for everyone. As they say, right? Fix the money, fix the world is sort of the going meme. That couldn't be truer.
I've got a few other characters in the space that I have in mind right now. Shout out to all of them that I've got to know that stumbled across it for different reasons, end up going to meetups, end up going to conferences. You started Bitcoin Alive and kindly had me go and MC the first 2 years that you did it. I'm gutted to say that I won't be able to make it this year because I'm hosting my family, but our lives have all drastically improved because of getting closer to this thing. What does it look like if everyone did the same thing? Well, you could make a pretty good guess that everyone's life would get drastically better. And it's like, wow, what if this kind of Bitcoiner ethos, characteristic, it's like a movie character, right? And you've got old school philosophy like Stoicism built right into it. You've used the word accountability. Like, this is something massive that I think one of the reasons you become a punk rocker is this sense of, well, there's no one accountable out there, so fuck them all. People say one thing and do another, and like, my life's no different. Do you know what I mean? It's that sense of nihilism that comes out of that. It's like, why would you do anything for anyone when the system's just never going to help you? So I do think that's a fascinating concept. Like, whoa, is this a snapshot of the future? Do you think it is?
Well, obviously I'm biased from my own experience.
And same, completely biased, yeah.
To your point, like, I was very, very pessimistic when I was younger. I hated everything and the world. I was in a heavy metal rock band screaming about how things sucked and how bad life was. And, not to give any like exaggeration here, but, I was very, very pessimistic. And I think a lot of younger people who haven't found Bitcoin feel the same sort of things, just in a perhaps different modern way. But there's a lot of doom and there's a lot of sadness and a lot of suffering around the world, and probably been around for a very long time in some capacity. But Bitcoin's totally flipped my like thinking of life. All those things are still true, but it gives me a more optimistic lens to look at the world now, because I do think that this is the life raft that we're looking for. I think the global impact of Bitcoin is going to be something researched in the future. How did the people not know in 2020 that this was going to do what it's done in 2100? We'll look back and think it was so obvious, but it clearly isn't, right? It still is globally accepted by a few percent of people. And the subset of that is like me and you, who are like super hardcore, is even like a 1% of that. So like, we're super, super early, and it's hard to kind of fathom what that future would look like. But I am much more optimistic about the future than what I was even just 10 years ago, thanks to Bitcoin and thanks to the adoption and the experience that I've had, and what it's done for me on a personal level. I think has the ability to scale to all 8 billion people, like I mentioned earlier. People just need to find a way to plug it into their own lives.
It's so cool. It's actually making me like flick back to one of the big aha moments for me, actually, as I kind of fell down the rabbit hole. 2020, I'd previously been working as investing my own money as an angel investor. I was looking for startups to do early stage equity deals with. And in particular, I was keen on environmental sustainability. And I was looking at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I was looking at the Paris Agreement and thinking about like what technology needs to exist to actually make these regulations come into reality, looking very closely at renewable energy, flexible load demand on the grids, all this kind of stuff. And one thing that I guess wasn't all that obvious at the time, but proved to be true in hindsight, was just every single opportunity was the same thing, which was hockey stick growth and up to the right. You know? And so when you really dug into it, it's like everything was still posited on the idea of like extraordinary growth and consumption. And so one thing I'd love to ask, Chris, is I've heard you describe yourself in the past as an entrepreneur that solves their own problems. Just talk us a bit through that philosophy. When you come across a problem, how do you identify it in the first instance? And then how do you decide that it's something you want to do something about?
Yeah, great question. I think I'll just add one thing to what you were previously saying before we jump onto this topic.
Yeah.
I'm going to butcher the quote, but it just reminded me of the classic, I can't remember who said it, but the idea of, and I'm paraphrasing, old men planting trees that they won't sit under. Like, it's just the idea of the time preference and thinking further ahead than your own lifespan or your own short-term thinking. Just what you were saying, just that brought that quote, even though I've totally butchered the quote.
Yeah, I've never heard that before, but it makes sense.
And I think if you go back far enough, a lot of people thought like this. It was just the norm. People that were building the pyramids, the people that were working on all these huge infrastructure projects that took decades. Like, what is it? La Familia Sagrada, I think it is, the church in Barcelona has been getting built for the last, call it 100 years or 80 years or something.
Really?
Like,
wow.
The people that started that are dead.
Yeah.
Then they don't even get to see the finished product, but they worked on it like it was the most important thing in their lives. And that's kind of how I feel about Bitcoin. I don't know if I'm going to be around I'm not going to be around when the last block's mined. I wish I was, but like, it's great to think about. But, my kids and my kids' kids will hopefully be around then, and they'll be able to appreciate that. And the foundation that I'm laying now for them, they'll be able to roll on with that. But yeah, sorry, back to your question about.
So I was asking about and that's a great
philosophy.
Point. You are building businesses, and you like solving your own problems. So talk us through what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this, again, is overly unique, but it's certainly how I got my start as an entrepreneur and started with businesses. Coinstop was the perfect example. I wanted to secure my Bitcoins and get them off exchanges and get them into more secure elements. And I looked around in the marketplace and came across the concept of a hardware wallet. Back then, there were like one, maybe two manufacturers, and that's it. And they had like one early wallet each. And I found that you couldn't buy it in the country. There was nobody selling it in Australia. Back then, you had to buy it directly from Europe or wherever the manufacturer was based. You had to pay in their local currency. You got slammed with a conversion charge. It took like 3 weeks to arrive. The customer support was non-existent. Barely even spoke English. It was a terrible experience. And I thought, wait a second. I've solved my own problem now. But the problem wasn't solved in the best way. I know I'm not unique in the marketplace and others have this same problem. What if I could solve that problem better for them than what it was solved for me? And that's how it started. We bought a box of 10 devices and we sold the first 10. I remember my co-founder saying, if we sell this, even if we sell one of these devices in the first 3 months, we'll buy a box of 20. We sold 10 of them in like a month. And we're like, oh, okay, let's buy 20. And we sold 20 in like the next 2 weeks. And then we're like, oh shit, okay, let's buy 50. And then we sold another 50 in a month. And then we're like, okay, we're just gonna have to keep scaling. We doubled our sales and our volume month on month, like for 6 months straight. If you double a few times in a row, it starts to become pretty crazy, even starting at 10, 20, 50, 100, 200, 500. It goes up very quickly. And so, yeah, in the first 12 months of business, we had sold well over $1 million worth of hardware wallets. We were just like, how did this happen exactly? Like I said, we were broke. We had scrounged around under the sofa and looked under the pillows for spare change to round up a few $100s each. kickstart this thing. And before you know it, we were looking at 7 figures, and we're just like, this is nuts for a first business that we thought was like a bit of a joke to solve our own problem. But I've taken that philosophy and applied that to every single one of the businesses that I've started. So Bitcoin Alive, you mentioned, same idea. So I've been lucky enough to travel around the world through a lot of my past jobs in this industry, and I've gone to some amazing countries and visited some amazing Bitcoin communities and Bitcoin events. And I've run a lot of events here in Australia as well since 2016 when I was living in Melbourne. So I've always been a very social and events kind of guy. But, I was kind of sick of having to go to these places. I know that sounds very privileged, but it's a long way to go. And a lot of people don't get that opportunity because they have families and they have careers. And it's a bit of an effort to go to like America for a weekend to go to a conference. So I wanted to bring that to Australia. I wanted to solve that problem for myself. I didn't want to have to always travel 20 hours on a plane to go to a conference and spend $5,000, $10,000. Why can't I just spend a few $100s and go to some capital city in this country? So looked around in the marketplace, found no one was doing it, decided to solve that problem for myself. And turns out hundreds of other people also suffer from that same problem and want that solution to be built. So that's kind of the way I look at it with business. I think it aligns the incentives really well as well. It's not just like I'm doing this to make money. A lot of the businesses I've had have been successful to their own degree, but they're not $100 million businesses. Maybe I'll come across one of those at some point in my career. I'm still relatively young. The point is that's not what drives me. What drives me is solving my own problems and solving other people's problems and doing what gives me purpose. The money will come to me when the money comes to me. I'm quite confident about that. If you hang in and around Bitcoin long enough, wealth will find its way into your pocket. I'm pretty sure about that. If I'm not, then I'm going to be turning my pockets inside out, begging for money in the future. But I don't think I'll be the only one doing that because a lot of people are highly leveraged into Bitcoin. So there'll be a whole host of us down the street looking for spare change for a place to sleep. But I think the days of that are probably sort of numbered. I don't think we're going to go down to any sort of zero or anything near that, but don't hold me to that. But yeah, that's kind of how I think about starting businesses. I think it's really good to have the operators aligned with what the customer's problems are. It's not just a transaction. It's not just, hey, I'm making money off this and some suckers are buying my product. It's like, hey, I'm making this product or I'm building this service because it solved my own problem. And now I want to branch and solve other people's problems. And you're genuinely, at least I am, I'm genuinely passionate about doing that. So when I sell hardware wallets to people, I do it at a fair price and I want to give them an honest experience and give them the support and make sure they don't make the same mistakes I made, coming into the business. So I think hopefully that answers your question in some way.
No, absolutely. And shout out to yourself and to Dylan and to Jess for getting Bitcoin Alive up and running. And I've been fortunate to MC a few of these events now, and they're all slightly different in their own way. But I was and remain just so impressed by the professionalism backstage with how Bitcoin Alive was managed, organized, and run on the day. It was absolutely awesome. I never expected to be on stage talking to people about Bitcoin and introducing panels and speaking with investors and it's just not something that I knew that as soon as I saw it was possible, it was something I wanted to do. But before that moment, I had no idea. It was like, that's not round the corner, is it? Where's Bitcoin Alive going over the next couple of years, Chris? And what gets you really excited?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know. And I appreciate those kind words about the professionalism.
It was cool, mate. It was really good.
We do our best. It's a hell of a lot of work. If people truly understood how much effort and how much time gets poured into this, I mean, there's a reason why it didn't exist before we did. And I think that reason is because it's crazy. It's not, the cost opportunity is terrible. The amount of time and the amount of expertise and skills required to pull this off in a fashion where people say things like, hey, that's really professional. It's, few people have that, but we're lucky to be able to put together a team that's competent. And, that goes beyond our direct team as well. There's so many people in the background, to yourself and others, countless others who help in their own way. And we're very appreciative of the support that we get from the community and everyone along the way. Because, whilst we're the captains of the ship, there are so many people in the engine room making sure that we're all powering ahead in the same way. But in terms of the future, it's hard to say, to be honest. I'd love to see this grow organically as Bitcoin continues to grow organically. There's so many unknowns. 12 months ago, if you asked me, would Bitcoin be a major political topic where a potential presidential campaign would get hinged upon, I would have said, what have you been smoking? But here we are now, and
that's moved much faster than I expected. Yeah,
and the meme has been right. Many of the memes, as jokey as they are often fairly spot on. Gradually, then suddenly, and maybe we're moving into that suddenly phase where things just before, like, you can't even blink, and you're like, oh, well, there's a strategic Bitcoin reserve now. How did that happen? That was a bit of a pipe dream just a few years ago, and now it's like front and center on the main stage. We're seeing a little bit of that unfold here. Australia is generally a little slower on the uptake with some of this stuff. We're still quite conservative, and our leadership is in a bit of shambles, and has been for quite some time. But in saying that, we've got a political party attending Bitcoin Alive this year who are going to be announcing a Bitcoin policy. That is a first in this country. Okay, it's not a major political party. They would certainly be welcome, and if they're listening, you should probably think about a Bitcoin policy, and we'd love to have your Bitcoin Alive talking about it. But you got to start somewhere. And so we are starting to see the early signs of Bitcoin being taken a bit more seriously, at least in this country, but certainly on a global level. What America's done over the last 6-12 months it's a huge backflip. Like 12 months ago, we'd be having this conversation and talking about choke point 2.0 and how banks are stifling capital and closing down businesses.
The on-ramps are fucked.
Yeah. And that is still true to some regard in this country as well. But at least if we're looking at America, and they're certainly the trendsetters, that's happened very quickly, like very, very quickly. And I'd like to hope that maybe we could have a similar timeline happen here in Australia as well, if we can just get the right people and the right leaders talking about the right things.
And so, Chris, one more question I'm intrigued about. I'm glad you brought up politics, because it's something I wanted to ask you about. Forgive me, I can't remember where I saw this, but I feel like Carrie was in the thread as well. Are you interested in politics? Could you ever see yourself in a political position? And what might you hope to achieve if you did?
It's a good question. I hate politics, at least in like the sense of how we see it from the everyday person. It's a lot of bickering, and it's a lot of just terrible decision making and inefficiency. That's kind of what drives me to want to make a change. I battle this constantly internally. Is like, do I just piss off, for a better lack of term, and go somewhere where the leadership is slightly better? There's no perfect place, but where you can make some better trade-offs. Or do I stand here and try to fight and make a difference in this country where I was born, and for all intents and purposes is one of the best countries in the world? It's just so goddamn beautiful, and we've got so much going for us. We're just kind of fumbling the ball. So maybe I could, I think I could be competent in that realm, but could I adhere to the kind of rigidness of how politics is structured? I think that would kill me. This is why I don't work in an office cubicle on the 40th floor in the city, because I think that environment would just suck the soul out of me. And I think politics is a little like that as well. I do like to think optimistically that there are people like me with those types of ambitions that do get into politics, that want to make real change, want to do all that stuff. But then as they get into it, they realize there's a fork in the road moment. It's like you either comply or you go nowhere. And so they make the compromise of complying, and before you know it, you get corrupted, and then you become one of, the party liners.
The problem.
Yeah, and they're probably great people, and they went in there with the right intentions. I'd hate for that to happen with me. I don't think it would. I think I'd just quit, because I'm quite strong, opinionated in that front. But whether that means I have a future in politics or not, I'm not sure. I'm certainly not making any decisions tonight or making any predictions. But I do think it would be good to have people who are a little bit more logical and a little bit more efficient in politics. Not to say I'm the best person for the job. I'm probably not. There'd be much better people qualified than me. But it'd be a better start, I think.
Because I think your comment was something along the lines of, you really enjoy speaking publicly. And like, to echo that, having seen you on stage and host a panel, etc., like, it's absolutely the case. Chris, it's been a wonderful time. I think if anything, you epitomize the the hard work, the accountability, the ethics, and the success of people that get closer to this thing, Bitcoin. So I really appreciate hearing the insights that you've shared today. So thank you so much for your time. If there's anyone that could make a difference in politics, then maybe it's people like yourself, because it is broken. But what does politics look like on a sound money standard? It would be very different to the bickering and unaccountability that we're so used to. And in some ways, I think it's the people that don't necessarily want the job are the right people for it. But anyway, yeah, wonderful to hang out this evening. Thank you so much for your time.
No worries, Jake. Thanks so much for having me, mate. It's always good.